My name is Charlene Margot. I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, and we are delighted and honored to have with us tonight Dr. Pamela Morris-Perez, who will be speaking to you from her own research and experience. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Dr. Morris-Perez. Take it away, Pamela.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. This is a phenomenal venture that you've got. Parenting is hard. Parenting teenagers is hard, and parenting a young person who's struggling is, one of the hardest things that I think that parents do. So first of all, I just want to thank all of you who've joined us today, because it's really brave of you to come out for a topic like this, suicide prevention, that scares everyone. I'm going to begin not with the academic or societal motivations for why I talk about suicide, but with the personal one. As you heard from my introduction, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for what we experienced as a family just over 5 years ago. So I lost my daughter, Frankie, to suicide. She was 17 years old. It was 3 weeks before her high school graduation. Frankie was not what you might think of when you picture a suicidal teen. She had very close, supportive friends. This is the way she'd walk down the street with her twin brother. They'd walk arm in arm. And so as a parent, I had many, many questions after she left us. But as a prevention and developmental scientist, those questions led me to read everything that I could to better understand both suicide and suicide prevention. And what was surprising to me is I couldn't find Frankie in what I read. I couldn't find her profound empathy. I couldn't find her resilience, and I couldn't find her light that seemed to transcend her emotional struggles. But what I did find in my reading was a path forward for perhaps the next Frankie, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. Now, first, in this new world, I was really confronted with a new language. I learned that those in the suicide community don't use the word committed suicide. And this picture here shows the wretched history of suicide and the reason why. This is a church in England. And the line that you see in the grass here marks where there used to be a fence that separated the gravestones of those people who died by all other causes from the gravestones of people who died by suicide. And while it's no longer a crime or a sin in most places to attempt to take your life, that history is actually not that far from us. And the language that we use still reflects that history. I learned that someone like myself who's lost somebody to suicide can be called, and I call myself a suicide loss survivor. Sometimes people who attempt suicide call themselves suicide attempt survivors. They've gone through a trauma, like a Holocaust survivor. They've gone through a trauma and have survived. Suicidology is the scientific field for the study of suicide. And as suicidologists, we study intervention programs for people who are already struggling with suicidality, prevention, and that's what I'm going to talk a lot about today, and something called postvention, which is support for communities and individuals after a suicide loss. But that language was just the tip of the iceberg for what I learned. I also learned about the very high prevalence of suicidality among young people, that 1 in 5 teens report having seriously considered suicide in the last year, and 1 in 10 teens report having attempted suicide in the last year. So that means 2 to 3 kids. This is sort of a mock high school class of about 25 kids. That means, 5 kids might have thought about suicide in the last year, and 2 to 3 kids might have attempted suicide in the last year. And I suspect you're thinking, well, that's because of COVID. COVID made a lot of things worse. And the challenge is that those numbers were nearly that high back in 2019, pre-COVID. They have continued to rise since, but it's really a continuation of rising trends that actually started 15 years ago. And so really what happened in COVID is we started paying attention more to issues of youth mental health and suicide. I learned about how much young people can camouflage their emotional pain, that it's not surprising to have a young child like a child like Frankie who can keep their suicidal thinking to themselves for a very long time. I also learned how unpredictable suicide is for both researchers and clinicians. There's a paper that came out in 2017 that basically took 50 years of research and tried to predict, based on risk factors, suicidal thoughts and behaviors, and found that our ability to predict suicidal thoughts and behaviors in both youth and young adults was no better than the flip of a coin. And we haven't gotten that much better in the last 50 years. And so that's a real problem. But for me, it was the combination of that very high prevalence, especially among young people, and the lack of prediction that argued that we should complement work that's going on in the formal mental health system, and wonderful work is going on there about effective treatments, but complement it with programs in the spaces where young people already are, in schools and emergency departments, in pediatric offices, and in homes. And it's why I'm excited to be here today to speak to you all about how you can really embed this in your homes and in your spaces that you're in. But it's really hard to prevent what we don't understand. And so one of the very first questions I often get is, when I talk about this topic, is what do you think causes suicide? And I could share with you the theories and the research on all of that. And there's lots of papers on it. I will say that most theories about suicide have been built for adults, and then they've been tested in adolescents with actually varying success, as you might not be surprised. But the way I understand this phenomenon is by this game, which many of you will recognize as the game of Jenga. So in Jenga, there's, of course, a tower made of blocks, and the object of the game, of course, you'll recall, right, is to pull out the blocks and to try not to let the tower fall. And the person who pulls the last block out makes the tower fall loses the game. And so the last block then was the cause of the tower falling, right? Well, no, of course not, right? It's really all of the things, right? It's all the blocks that led to that last block falling that really was the cause of the blocks falling down. And just like that, suicide can be caused by mental illness or trauma or loss, but there's many, many causes, from the biological to the environmental. And a lot is really unknown about that. But so like I said, it's sort of this confluence of factors across everything. Sorry, I'm just trying to fix my face here and I'm losing myself. So it's a little complicated. There we go. Okay. Now, for many of us, when we think about suicide, the idea of suicide really eludes us. You know, how can somebody want to die, right? Doesn't that go against our basic understanding, sort of human instincts, our will to live? And it turns out that actually suicide is not at all about wanting to die, or not fully about that. It can actually also be about just wanting to end severe emotional pain. So just like we are hardwired to pull our hand away from a burning stove and avoid physical pain, we are also hardwired to avoid severe emotional pain as well. And so since suicide can then be understood as sort of part and parcel of the human condition, as someone with severe, unrelenting emotional pain that sees no other way out of their pain. And so then our role as parents and teachers and other people that are engaged with young people is to do what we can to relieve young person's emotional pain. And I'll talk about how we can do that, and help our teens find other ways for relief, alternatives to suicide, and help them find ultimately their own reasons for living. And particularly for those, for adolescents, is with those aspects of adolescent that they're grappling with, right? They're grappling with a sense of identity. How do they talk about who they are? And finding their place in the world, a sense of purpose, right? Identity and purpose, right? Two sort of major tasks of adolescence. And I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. So as I thought about strategies for prevention, I looked to work in other fields. And one of the areas I looked at actually surprisingly was from industrial accidents. And I came upon James Reason's work. He studied high reliability organizations. These are like nuclear aircraft carriers and air traffic control systems. And he articulated that sort of different approaches to what he called safety management, right? And he said, there's the person model. We can blame the person at the end of the line, right? There's the engineering model. We could blame the whole tower, right? But there's also the organizational model. We can also think about ways, how do we make places safer, right? How do we make air traffic control systems safer, not just the pilot safer? And he articulated a strategy that he called the Swiss cheese model, which I kind of love because it feels very accessible. And he says we can't change the human condition, but we can change the conditions under humans work. He argued that actually there are gaps in each of our levels, right? In homes and schools and neighborhoods and communities. And we want to do everything we can to close those gaps. But we also want to make sure that we're embedding safety in all of those levels, essentially, so that they may not line up in ways that we can sort of reduce risk for as many people as possible. And so when I talk about suicide prevention, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about embedding prevention sort of everywhere so that we can really reduce risk. We can catch kids as much as possible. So one solution for suicide is a layered approach where we expect risks, but we work really hard to close them. But we hope that they're not lined up, and we hope we can catch kids. So I started writing a series of pieces that I would entitle initially What Ifs. They were named after the relentless thoughts that I had that invaded my my thinking after we lost our daughter. And I decided to recast them as musings about suicide. And the first one that I decided to write was, what if we approach suicide prevention the way we do car accidents? And I wrote a piece that came out in the New York Times in March of 21, renamed by an incredibly wise editor. But really it was about what if we think about suicide this way? What if we think about prevention this way? And it turned out that actually the more I read about it, the more I realized it's a really perfect analogy, because the history of car accident safety, right? Seatbelts, actually, history of seatbelt safety is actually really akin to where we are with suicide prevention today. So it turns out that back in the 80s, when I was a teenage driver, inexperienced drivers, young people, were dying in car accidents, and people and the adults around them were really worried about it. And the one solution that we had, seatbelts, were used actually by very few people. Only 15% of people in the 80s used a seatbelt. And it didn't save everybody, but it saved a whole lot of people. And together, right, we created a system of protection, right, that included signs on the highway, like click it or ticket, laws, right, that will ticket you if you don't use your seatbelt, right, car companies, which embedded those annoying but necessary beeping sounds so that you click your seatbelt, driver's education, et cetera. We all built it, we all worked hard together, public, private, et cetera, in building safety around young people. Now 90% of people use seatbelts as a result of all of the efforts that happened. So I suggested in that article a layered approach with roles for pediatricians and orthodontists and school personnel and parents and friends. And I'll get back to the friend issue in a little bit. Now, one of the major, so now turning to suicide prevention, a key part of suicide prevention are the helplines, like you just heard at the beginning of this talk from Star Vista. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about their history because I actually think it's relatively instructive. So helplines are phone numbers that people can call to receive emotional support, 988 in the US now. And they started with this priest named Chad Vera in 1952 in the UK. And basically what happened was that in 1935, Chad Vera officiated at the funeral of a girl who died by suicide when she got her first period. She didn't understand what was happening to her, and she thought something was terribly wrong, and she took her life. And so, and she didn't have anyone to tell her that like this was a normal part of puberty and part of growing up. Now, Chad Vera never forgot her, and 17 years later, he opened his door up and said, anyone who's suicidal or struggling, please come and speak to me. And he was really good at what he did. And the response was much greater than he expected. And he hired all these volunteers to work with him and sit with people and wait with them while they were waiting to see him, offer them tea or what have you. This was England. And one day he opened his door expecting the crowds that he normally saw, and his waiting room was empty. And he realized that something magical was happening between the volunteers and the people that had come to see him. And that magic thing he called befriending. And the people that did it, he called befrienders. And he created something called Befrienders Worldwide. And essentially, it was based on active listening, acceptance, understanding, empathizing, no giving of advice or counseling. And I tell you this story for two reasons. One is so that you know if you call 988 and you get connected to Star Vista or another crisis center, if you're not in that location, you know what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is do the befriender approach. They're trying to listen actively, accept, understand, and empathize. They are not trying to give advice or give counseling. The other thing is to demonstrate to all of you that if volunteer attendance back in 1952, sitting in waiting rooms with no training can ease pain, you can do that too. And I'm going to tell you what we think they did. Okay, what else very quickly works in suicide prevention, just so you're aware, sort of at the sort of community level, at the universal level? Well, we know that actually accepting policies make a difference. So Julie Reifman's done some wonderful work on same-sex marriage laws, which happened at different times in different states, and found that when states passed same-sex marriage laws, they saw reductions in suicidal risk, both for LGBT plus kids, but also for all kids. And it was timed, because it was timed with the passage of the laws that happened at different times in states. This was before federal protections. She was able to attribute that reduction to same-sex marriage laws. Keeping people safe also really matters. So what we call lethal means restriction, right? Keeping people from ways in which they could take their life. So that means barriers on bridges, on buildings, et cetera. And also, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, things that you could do in your homes to help kids stay safer. Screening matters. So in pediatric offices and emergency departments, there are brief screening tools that's specifically for suicide. And it turns out that it needs to be specific around suicidal risk, because screening for just depression or anxiety, which a lot of pediatricians used to do instead of screening for suicide risk, actually mixed a pile of kids that were suicidal but not either depressed or anxious. And the American Academy of Pediatrics now recommends screening for teenagers, regular screening of them. So you could ask your pediatrician, are you screening for suicide risk? And then there's community-wide prevention. I won't talk a lot about this, but the Garrett Lee Smith Memorial actually invested in communities in ways that actually they put together a lot of strategies, stigma reducing strategies, suicide awareness strategies, helpline information, all of the things, and actually see reductions in suicidal risk among young people in communities where those investments have been made. So we do know that some things do work. Now, I'm in an education school at NYU, and my focus before I got into suicide prevention was on early education. And so I really cared about what was happening in schools and what do we know about what can happen in schools. It turns out that the programs that train adults, which most schools do, are good, but not enough. So there are these adult-focused programs, we call them gatekeeper programs, because they're not trying to make teachers into mental health clinicians. They're just trying to help teachers recognize the signs and know how to talk to a kid and connect them to care. And those programs do improve adult knowledge, but they don't typically improve student help seeking. So we don't see kids asking for help more when we train the adults, and we only train the adults. It turns out to help kids seek help more, we need to train young people themselves. And you wouldn't be surprised by this, right? If you have a young person in their life, their primary confidant is often their friends. So we really need to be really focused on peers. And there are some programs with evidence of efficacy, sources of strength, signs of suicide, something called Youth Aware of Mental Health. And I'm going to talk about one more. But it turns out there's very little research on marginalized youth. And that's something else. So the work needs to actually continue on the research side, but we do know some things. I'm going to talk about another program in a minute. Because it turns out the successful programs really build on what I know as a developmental psychologist matters for adolescent development. And what is that? Well, we know that the stage salient tasks of adolescence are autonomy and identity, right? You know this, if there's a young person in their life, they are trying to separate from you and re-engage with friends, and also try to start understanding who they are and articulate that, right? The very important role that peers play in adolescent lives. We tend to focus only on peer pressure, and that is an issue, but peers also play a hugely positive role in their friends' lives. So really good studies of safe driving, for example, and other things, that peers are influenced by the positive behavior of their friends as well as the risky behavior. And that young people are really guided by what we call norms. And norms tell a young person what's common in a space, and also what's approved, what is an approved behavior. And those norms, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, are dynamic. So they're not static, they change. And we can test and retest them through observation. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if I'm a young person and I'm in a school where we talk openly about mental health, and we bring our friend over to the counselor, that gives me one set of messages about what's okay in this space, that this is a school that wants us to talk openly about it when we're struggling, celebrate successes, and is there to help us. If I'm, by contrast, in a school where we never talk about it, we don't know where the counselor is, then that's a space where I'm going to learn a different set of messages, and I'm going to learn to keep it to myself. Right. So it's, again, the more we do it, the more we model that it's okay to do it. And what's also really interesting, and I'll do this relatively quickly, but it actually sort of maps onto what we know about adolescent brains now. So we used to think that adolescent brains were just these two systems. There was like an air traffic control system and an emotion system. And the problem was that the emotions were sort of taking over and not giving space to the air traffic control. Right. And so all the work was trying to just help kids sort of dampen down their emotions, like regulate your emotions so you can actually think rationally. But it turns out that adolescent brains are actually in three parts. There's the cognitive control system, the prefrontal cortex. There's the amygdala, that's where all the emotions are. But there's a third part, this thing called the ventral striatum. And what that is really the approach system. And you're not surprised by this, right? Because young people like to take risks, but those risks can be negative risks, right? Challenging risks that we're all worried about adolescents do, but they also can be positive risks. They can be trying out for plays and trying out for sports teams, and also taking the risk to break trust with a friend and bring them over to a mental health counselor. And so suicide prevention programs can also really leverage those positive risks. And as I was looking at prevention programs, I also was really inspired by Frankie's friend community. So as an artsy kid, Frankie spent tons of time in her theater office at her school. It was tucked behind the door on the 6th floor of a large and bustling New York City high school. And it's where she dropped her lunch, where she dropped her backpack and ate her lunch on a couch and snuggled in a pile of kids on a kind of well-worn couch. But it's also where she would go when she was struggling. There was a little corner of that office where actually the kids can kind of hide away from prying adult eyes. And one day there was a kid that was about a year younger than Frankie who went in there to cry because she was having a tough day. And Frankie found her in that little corner and just sat with her. And what the what the young person has told us is the ways in which she just sat by sitting with her in that space. She felt comforted. She felt better. And so the fall after Frankie left us, she and her friends rebuilt that space, and they called it the Love Vestibule. They decorate it with these Post-its that say things like "You matter" and "It gets better" and phone numbers to call for help. And so when I was looking for prevention programs, I wanted ones that would mirror what I saw in Frankie's community. These are kids who, after a profound loss, they built a space with support and affirmation and healing. And that led me to a program called Directing Change. So Directing Change is actually a California-based program. So in your backyards, it's suicide prevention in the form of a film contest. So it was developed by these two wonderful people, Yana Scherspatowski and Stan Collins. They run a nonprofit. Yana runs a nonprofit called Youth Creating Change in San Diego, but the program is available for all kids throughout the state of California. It's been serving kids across California for a decade. Basically, what happens is kids make 30 and 60-second films in mental health awareness and suicide prevention. They submit them to a statewide contest on March 1st of every year, and they have very clear rules about how to make sure these films are safe. They get about 1,000 films a year, and it's grown a lot. And then a few years ago, they packaged the program for schools. So where a school advisor, like a teacher of an English class or film class or a mental health club or a GSA club, will lead a whole group of students in making films. And when they do that, the schools receive resources from the program, technical assistance. They agree to submit at least 5 films to the contest. And then they plan an event to share those films within their school and sometimes beyond. Sometimes they're shown in local movie theaters or in sports arenas as well. So they really get wide reach. Basically, the films are really simple. They're trying to do three things. How do you basically teach a kid? How do you recognize the signs that your friend might be struggling? How do you find the words to ask directly the question, are you thinking about suicide? And I'll talk to you in a minute about why it's okay to ask that question. And how do you connect your friend to care? And the easiest thing for me to do is I'm going to play a film because you'll see it. It's only a minute.
Come on, pick up.
It's Alex. You know what to do.
Hey, bro. Look, I'm just gonna be totally honest with you right now. I've noticed that you've been acting weird for a few weeks now, and then you didn't show up to school today. And I'm just starting to get really worried about you. I gotta ask, are you thinking about suicide at all? I mean, I realize you can't answer that question because you're on the phone, but look, if you're listening to this right now, just please leave a number. Just call that number before you make a decision. Look, there are people here to help you go through this. You're absolutely not in this alone. Yeah, I'm here for you too. I'm gonna try your house and see if you're there. Okay, bye.
Orange County Mental Health Crisis Line. My name is Chris. How can I help you today?
Hi.
Super powerful films made by young people. There's a lot of them. So these are safe, they're positive, they're action-oriented messages. They are by youth, for youth. Youth are embedding their identities in the films, so that the films from, the northern part of California look different from the ones in the southern part, from urban and rural places look different. They're organically tailored to person and place. And when they do it in schools, it becomes ecologically influenced. It's really that sort of Swiss cheese model, because it starts with kids in classrooms and really infuses through the schools. And sometimes they talk to their families about the films, et cetera. And then in 2020, they added a monthly contest. So they have a monthly Hope and Justice art contest. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the very end, but that's available too for young people, where they can articulate times they did something hopeful, and times that they combated injustices in their world. Okay, so what can you do? What can parents do to prevent suicide? All right, so the first thing is to ask yourself these questions. So these are sort of the warning signs, what we call warning signs. And as I said at the beginning, we don't do a great job with prediction, but I'm still going to say them out loud. Has your child lost interest in things? And are they having dramatic mood changes or changes in behavior? Are they getting more angry or agitated or irritable? So not always sad, sometimes other emotions. Are they engaging in more risky behavior? And the last one is a big one. Have they given away their belongings? Now, some of these could be typical, normal teenage angst behavior, but if they're happening, those are the kinds of things you want to look for. This other list on the side is actually from the Youth Creating Change group. They developed it with these and other warning signs. And then there are a couple more critical warning signs that actually you need to take very, very seriously. And if any of them are present, you do want to either call 988, the Star Vista Crisis Center, or another mental health professional with training in suicide prevention right away. And that is talking or writing about death or suicide, seeking methods for a suicide attempt, including searching online, and talking about feeling hopeless, wondering, does it all matter, and saying they have no reason to live. So those are things you want to act on right away. Okay, so since we often can't see these things, all of them, and sometimes we can't even predict it, how do we have a conversation with a young person about suicide? I think this is the scariest thing to think about and think about doing. And many of you are probably thinking, there's no way I could ever talk to my young person in my life about this topic. And the first thing you have to do is create a safe space to have the conversation. And truthfully, it's not about having all the answers or even having any answers, but it's about sitting with them in their emotional pain. Remember that they feel powerless, they're in emotional pain, and letting them share that pain with you or with someone else can actually ease it, just like Frankie did in that theater space. It's like letting the air out of a balloon. You know that when you're really struggling and you share, you feel a little bit better, and that's what happens. So I love this little cartoon. The tiny dragon says, life is like a pot of tea. Sometimes it's too much for one person. Share it if you can. There's also this wonderful article that came out from David Brooks back in 21 called What Do You Say to the Sufferer? He describes how Rabbi Elliot Kukla once described a woman with a brain injury who would sometimes fall to the floor, and people around her would rush immediately to get her back on her feet before she was quite ready. And she told Kukla, I think people rush to help me up because they're so uncomfortable seeing an adult lying on the floor. But I really needed someone to get down on the ground with me. So that's what you're trying to do. How do you get down on the ground with the young person and sort of give them a space to talk about their pain? Kukla did point out in the end of that article that getting on the floor can be anxiety provoking. And when someone's in deep despair, even dangerous for the strongest caregiver. This is scary and this is hard. But sometimes you just get on the floor. Sometimes you make sure there's somebody to catch you afterwards because this was really hard. And sometimes you do have to get somebody else in your space to sit on the floor in emotional pain with your young person that you care about. So the biggest misconception, and I already touched on this a little, about suicide is the thinking that if I talk about it, I'm going to put the idea, I'm going to suggest it, right? Teens are really suggestive. Won't I put the idea in their head if I ask them about it? And the answer is to, emphatically no. It is absolutely okay to talk about suicide. I'm going to say it out loud again. Talking about suicide does not increase the risk of suicidal behavior. And I know that because there was a really careful study done a long, long time ago, actually 20 years ago, by Maddie Gould at Columbia. She did a randomized trial, the strongest possible study, to really understand if asking about suicide resulted in more suicidal thinking. And in fact, there was no effect, but the opposite was true, that actually by asking about it, those young people who were struggling the most actually saw a slight reduction in their distress. And now that's been confirmed in other meta-analyses with both youth and young people. So why do we think that's the case? Well, I don't think we've actually gotten a frame for that from the research, but the way I think about it, because I used to do work in early education, is that if you walk into an early childcare center, right, you'll hear a teacher say something like, hey, Johnny, it looks like you're really angry, or you're really frustrated, you're really sad. And we do that, and we use these cards actually to teach kids about emotions. We do that because we think that if you understand your emotion, you can regulate it better. So understanding allows you to regulate it. And I think the same is true for adolescents. So if we teach them difference between stress and anxiety, between panic attacks, sadness, depression, suicidal thinking, those are all different emotions. If we start helping them label them, it can actually start helping them regulate them better, because different things may help them for the different emotions. And we just don't give them a lot of space to talk about it all the time. And I just don't think we understand that much because of the history of suicide as a crime or a sin, we've often actually shut down conversation rather than opened it up. So how do you talk about suicide? You ask directly the question, and I know it's hard. You can say, hey, just like that kid in that video, I noticed you've been acting really strange lately, and I just have to ask, are you thinking about suicide? Or I went to a talk and I heard that young people sometimes think about suicide, and I just have to ask, are you thinking about suicide? And then you want to stop talking, because what you don't want to do next is say, of course you're not, right? Which is the natural thing to do next. You just want to stop. My colleague says you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that you listen more than you speak. And if they say yes, you can talk to them the way you do about other health things. So if they come to you with a headache, you ask them a set of questions about how much it hurts and how long you felt that way, and what happened right before you had the headache, and what happened right after. And you can ask all those same questions around suicide. And what it does is it gives space for them to start understanding it and talking about it comfortably with you. You don't want to fix it just like the befrienders, right? I know it's scary, and I know you want to help them, and I know you want to do what you did when they were 2, which is pick them up and, give them a Band-Aid. But the truth is, you want to take it seriously, but you do want to stay calm. And there's wonderful language that you can use. There's a wonderful book by Stacey Friedenthal here, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts. She actually, some of that language on her website called speakingofsuicide.com. If you forget it, it's at the end of every article that mentions the word suicide in the New York Times, they have this website. And you can use, it really helps give you language so you have something to say. You can say, I'm so glad you told me you're thinking of suicide. You don't want to minimize. You don't want to say, but you have so much to live for, or tomorrow it'll be better. You want to ask them what's going on that's making them feel that way, or tell me more. You can say, I hope you'll keep talking to me about it. Again, you don't have to have all the answers. You do want to make safety a priority, just like when your child was young and you baby-proofed your home. You want to do the same thing actually for any young person, and especially someone who's struggling with suicide. That means removing or securing weapons, securing and storing medications with something called a lockbox. You can get it from the neighborhood drugstore. And that you should put in it all of your prescription medications from like being at the orthodontist that you haven't used. You should put in it Tylenol, which is also lethal, right? Anything else that is lethal, you want to put in that lockbox just to reduce access to lethal means. You can create a safety plan with your child, with your teenager or a friend. There's a wonderful app called the Stanley Brown Safety app. You download a safety plan. Mental health professionals are doing these with young people. So if they see somebody, you can also ask for a copy of it, and it allows them to do all those things around like the headache conversation. What are their warning signs? What are their coping strategies? Who will they call if they're struggling? And you can help them download a wellness app like the Virtual Hope Box or others and review it with them from time to time. Now, the next steps, the most important one is if a young person is having thoughts about suicide, just thinking about it is not necessarily, they don't need to like go somewhere immediately. But if they're having thoughts and they have a plan and they have access to that plan, they need to be evaluated by a mental health professional with training in suicide prevention. You need immediately to have them evaluated by a professional. You can call that local crisis line that you heard at the beginning from Star Vista. You can call 988. You can call your pediatrician, but make sure they have experience with suicide as well. And you want to do that right away. And you would also want to care for yourself, just like on the airplane when they say, take care of yourself before you take care of others. Same thing here. I'm noticing we're really close on time, but I will just say there are resources out there to help. Suicideispreventable.org. Trevor Project has an LGBT plus line that's wonderful for LGBT plus kids. 988 has a lot of resources. The last thing I just want to leave you with, because the title of the talk was Hope. And I think it's really confusing about how do you give someone else hope? And the way I think about it is actually this fictional book. So Kate DeCamillo wrote this wonderful book called Magician's Elephant, but she describes a scenario where a young boy goes to see an elephant who's essentially really depressed because the townspeople have put him in a castle and for them to visit him. And he says to the elephant, like, open your eyes, because he has a question for the elephant. And the elephant finally opens his eyes. But when the elephant does that, the young boy actually forgets the question he was going to ask, which was about finding his sister, and sees the elephant's pain. And what Kate writes is that in that moment, the elephant felt hope. And I say that because it's not always about like serving up a new future for your child. It's really about seeing them in their pain and letting them share it with you. And the final thing I'm just going to show you about hope is a virtual art gallery that was created by the young people that sent in their materials, their artwork, and their music to the Youth Creating Change monthly art contest. Because I think when we put this work back in the power of young people, back in the hands of young people, they really, really could show us what hope that they have. So I'm going to play that as my last slide.
You might feel like you're alone, like you have no one and nowhere to go. But if you look on the other side of the rainbow, you can turn to anyone you know. Dark thoughts can shadow one's vision, them feel like they're the worst. But take my hand and know you're not alone. Help is out there, you'll find a way. Reach out today.
So with that, I'm gonna stop share so we can start talking.
Well, Pamela Morris-Perez, that was extraordinary. We talk about this subject a lot, but you have given us an insight that most folks don't have. And we're sorry that you have that particular insight, but where are you making a difference in the world? So thank you for that. Really beautiful. So you talked about one of the prevailing myths that most scares parents and adults, which is talking directly to kids. Another one is, only kids with severe mental health crises take their own lives. But we know now that those things aren't true. Why are those myths so pervasive, do you think?
So, I mean, I think the talking about it one is pervasive because for two reasons. One is that we've never given people a frame for understanding why that wouldn't be the case. And kids, we do put ideas in kids' heads all of the time. And I think we've never talked about it the way we've talked about the emotion understanding. And I think that's the biggest challenge. Also, historically, people were, really worried. The only way we thought that we could stop suicides in the old days was making it a sin or a crime. And that was actually for a good reason, right? We thought, well, if we don't talk about it and we make it a sin or crime, we'll actually stop it. And it turns out the opposite was true. It didn't stop suicides. It stopped help seeking instead. And so it turns out when we talk about it, you get that relief of relieving yourself, right? You get the break, right? One of the stories I often say is, imagine your child had to, went to school and found a penny on the ground and put it in their pocket, but all day long they couldn't talk about the fact that they had a penny in their pocket, right? What would they be thinking about all day long when they're at school, right? That penny. We just don't give them a space to share it. And I think that's the challenge.
Really interesting. Like you, I'm a former early childhood educator, and we spent a lot of time training our little kids at Stanford to name their emotions. But we knew that we needed to keep that going. Like I did with my children, I'm sure you did with your children. But it's complicated. I think about Lisa D'Amour, who you probably know, Lisa, clinical psychologist. And she gave this brilliant talk of what she said is basically, we've kind of done our kids a disservice by making them think that negative emotions are not okay, right?
Yeah.
I think we have to start better teaching, you could speak to this, that we all have this extreme, emotions go like this all the time for everyone.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I will say that you talking about it for yourself, I'm really, just the way teachers model for little kids, right? Parents can model for young people. I'm really stressed out right now, right? We don't want to overdo it, but it's okay to be honest about it. I remember once when I was with a 4-year-old and I had lost something and I said I didn't want to cry in front of them. And a friend of mine said, I think it's okay for them to see that adults cry too. And right, that's what we need to show teenagers, because otherwise they think they're going crazy, right? Whereas instead they're getting all of the emotions that we all feel as adults. And in spades, right? They're getting really good.
So like you say, maybe let that person lie on the floor for a minute.
Yeah.
Be yourself. Show your kids their emotions. Is that what you're saying?
100%, exactly right. I actually saw a video once on social media where a young person was having a really rough day and laid down, and what the parent did was just literally lie down right next to them and just don't say anything, just lay there with them, because sometimes that's what you need.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So we have some great questions coming in. Not easy, but great questions. Here's one. Some people just absorb everyone else's emotions and it's just overwhelming to live with them. What is the solution for helping those individuals change their physiology?
Yeah, I mean, Frankie was one of these kids, right? Super empathic, right? And it does open you up to both, the beauty of the world and the love in the world, but also its pain. And the world is super complicated right now. So there's a lot of pain out there, and and kids are getting that information also on their phones as well, in addition to what they might see around them in their sort of immediate environment. And so the best thing to do is to continue to teach them, like, yeah, it's hard. And yes, we do have to figure out how to manage it, right? How to build those resilience skills, right? That Lisa talks about and others talk about, right? How do we, deep breaths and find activities that actually reduce that stress, so we have a space for it all to go, right, over time.
Yeah, like that wonderful organization you talked about where the kids can make films. Do
Right.
something creative with what you're feeling, right?
Yeah. And they get to basically say how hard it is, but they're doing it through filmmaking, right? And so those kinds of activities could be great. For other kids, it could be being on a sports team, right? And figuring out how to run it off, right? It depends on the kid, right? Of course. But yeah, so lots of ways in which, and giving them spaces, like I say, to just talk about it, to air it, and all of that as well.
So Dr. Morris-Perez, speaking of pain, a very recent study I'm sure you've heard about from the Trevor Project based here in San Francisco has just come out with astonishing data about how at risk for suicide are our LGBT, trans, and non-binary kids. Can you speak to that for a second?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say clearly, it's nothing about the kids themselves that's driving the greater risk. Right? It's about the fact that they're living in spaces in a world where they are not always accepted. It's why those accepting policies, right, same-sex marriage laws, right, actually make a difference. So it is not specific to the individual, it's to the spaces that they're in. And the more that we can do to sort of demonstrate our acceptance and understanding and curiosity about that, for parents who might not fully understand it yet, is really important and becomes a very important piece of all of this. Yeah, but the rates are much higher. They're particularly high for trans kids and bisexual kids, also multiracial kids. I do think there is something about kids who we call them liminal kids in our team a little bit, kids who sometimes don't have a home, so to speak, don't have a space for belonging, right? A bisexual kid might not be accepted by either the gay kids or the straight kids. Right. And that can be complicated.
Yeah, and parents and educators on with us tonight. My guess is you seem like a really educated group, but that risk is up to 72% for these kids. So it is a huge number.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's definitely kids that you want to pay attention to. But the more that they're in accepting places, it can make a big difference.
Okay, absolutely. I know this would probably take the rest of the night, but just quickly, I'm going to ask you, how has social media impacted how kids react or are impacted for suicide?
Yeah, it's complicated, right? So, on the one hand, there's, books out now and articles all the time about how social media is terrible for kids. I will say, if you talk to young people, they also will say that sometimes that they find spaces online that they couldn't find locally. The single trans kid in a school might have their only trans community online, and that's important too.
Yeah.
One of the best, so the way I think about it is that social media is here. Yes, it should be monitored, but we need to figure out how to learn with it rather than just push it away, because it is amongst us. And there is a wonderful program called Chat Safe. It has a set of guidelines. It was actually developed out in Australia. And it's about how do you manage, how do you have hard conversations? How do you talk safely about suicide online? How do you manage conversations? How do you report things that you find? And also appropriately, how do you manage after a suicide death as well online for online conversations? So it's Chat Safe, and it's wonderful, by a group called Origin. Joe Robinson is the researcher.
Okay, thank you for that, Pamela. So we're getting close to the end, but you mentioned that you might give us a few more minutes, and we have questions where,
yes,
if you don't mind, and audience, if you need to go right at the end of the half hour, that's fine, but we're going to stay on for another couple minutes because I want Dr. Morris-Perez to get a chance to answer these questions.
Of course.
What if kids are good? We have several questions similar to this idea. What if kids are good at hiding? How can you approach them if they deny having suicidal thoughts when really they may be hiding them due to shame or other discomfort?
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of the hardest things, right? And often if you ask a kid, are they suicidal? They'll say no almost immediately because they're very scared of being locked up, right? They're very scared that they will lose everything. They're going to be stuck in an inpatient unit and locked off from everything that's actually helping them feel better.
Yeah.
And so I think the only way to address that is actually to just keep talking about it and say, okay, maybe you're not feeling this way now, but if you ever are, know that I'm here. And here's some things that I found out could be useful if you or your friends ever are, right? Chances are if they're not struggling, that their friends may be struggling. And so also you can give them those resources as well. Tell them about 988, tell them about Star Vista Crisis Center, right? Leave that around. They could all have that programmed on their phone. So sometimes they don't want to talk to you, but maybe they want to talk to somebody else about it. And I do think you just keep talking about it. You keep keeping it open. The shame only goes away as they learn about more people who, also talk about it and they realize that they're not alone in it, right? And that's why I think those films are so powerful, because they see their friends saying like, hi, I'm struggling, right? And then all of a sudden like, oh, I don't have to be ashamed of this. Maybe like this person that I look up to also struggles. There's wonderful also videos like Jed Foundation sees the awkward videos. So Billie Eilish talks about struggling and things like that, which can also be good. Yeah. And I see people also putting in things about trusted adults and stuff like that.
That's right. Sometimes it's not a parent. Sometimes it's another. It can be a relative. It can be a coach.
Yeah.
It can be a favorite teacher. All
Yeah.
kinds of people, right? It does take a village.
Yeah.
So Pamela, the writer asks here, my daughter has depression and anxiety. Are there specific signs I should look for that indicate suicidality versus depression and anxiety?
I mean, again, we tend to think that depression is the only thing that happens with suicidal thinking. And I think what's really important is that like depression is one clinical condition, anxiety is a different clinical condition, and suicidal thoughts are a third thing, right? And sometimes it's what's called comorbid, right? It co-occurs, but sometimes it's not, right? Some kids are suicidal and depressed or anxious. Some kids are depressed and not suicidal. I mean, again, the best thing to do is to continue to talk about it. I would also urge any parent of a teen, but especially a parent of a teen who is struggling with depression or anxiety, is to actually do all of the safety stuff that I suggested. I remember after my New York Times piece came out, a parent wrote to me and said, my kid's been depressed and actually been on medication for a long time. And I didn't think it was an issue that they had the medication just sitting in their medicine cabinet and they had access to it like that. And so talking to them about, what, I want to make sure you're safe. And so I'm going to put it here and we're going to figure out a way for you to have it and need it. But keep them away from it, in case a suicidal crisis emerges.
Thank you for that. Really, really important advice. So here's one, and my guess is this is a common question. How do we help young adult children living away from home, like at university, where they may have medications with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's much more complicated. I mean, I think, again, you want to talk to their mental health provider. Maybe they're not at risk for suicide, right? And maybe then it's okay. But you want to talk to the mental health provider. You could talk to the counseling center at the school about whether some places might have a process by which they dole out the medications. Maybe other places they don't. How do you actually support them? And just check in with them a lot. Again, in some universities, and I know actually at NYU and other places, there's a set of students that are trying to push to make sure that actually RAs in dorms are also getting trained, as well as, faculty and staff and all of the things. So I think there's a push actually in New York for to push it at the legislature level, so that all universities and colleges within the state are doing those kinds of things. So that's another thing, like you really want, people around them to be trained. You do want, it's nice when the ID cards have the number on the back of them as well, so people remember them. Again, you just want to be checking in with your kid a lot, that's what it's all about.
My daughter was an RA at Stanford and they got a lot of suicide prevention training.
Yeah.
And the kids absolutely agreed that you got to just go direct. You've just got to ask those questions, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, here's a good question. Has there been any study about depression medications, considering so many of our kids are on them,
Mhm.
and a higher risk for suicidality?
Oh, you mean in terms of a reverse effect, basically
Well,
more suicidal thinking,
do
like
the
a black
meds,
box warning?
is there any connection between those meds and
So
suicidality?
yeah, so I'm not an expert in that area of research, so I just want to sort of acknowledge that there are medications out there that are, you know, prescribed for depression, and some of them have black box warnings around suicide risk, but some don't. And again, you know, the challenges with all these medications is they do work, but for some people, but they don't work for everybody, and they take a while to kick in. So it can be hard. Again, you just want to keep the conversation going and keep checking in about it.
Okay. And Pamela, sadly, one of the reasons we reached out to you is we had a recent loss in our community the day
Yeah.
before school started. Do you have any advice for families, kids going through that kind of loss at their school?
Yeah, I'm so, you know, I just want to say that, you know, I am deeply sorry for your community. It's incredibly hard when this stuff happens.
Mhm.
I think the most important thing is to talk about grief, talk about the loss. You do want to, you know, you don't want to shut down conversations. I mean, you want to talk about suicide, but you also want to talk about grief and loss. Like, it's hard. You know, one of the things that we did in our family is we had a lot of Frankie's friends over. She had so many friends, and they came over a lot and talked with us. And we gave them space to just say, like, yeah, I'm really struggling. And, you know, we talked about the different ways that we were grieving and allowed them to sort of talk about the different ways that they were grieving as well. And I think the more, again, you can just talk about, like, it's really hard when somebody dies and you don't expect it.
Mhm.
The other piece that's really important to remember is this stuff is complicated. Everybody feels like it was their fault. Everybody feels like that, or many people do. If I just said hi one more time, if I just responded to some text, if I had called them, if I'd gotten them to do something. And I think we believe we all have an impact on other people, but in the end, the only person that's responsible for whether they live or die is the person that makes that choice. And we could argue whether it's a choice or not a choice and all that. And you know, I'm not blaming them at all. It's fully understandable in a very difficult, very tough space. But I do think it's one of these things that I just want to say that, like, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. It takes a long time. The healing takes, you know, and it can be a forever thing. But it does get better. It's a slow process.
Yeah.
And just lean on each other. Take your time.
Well, we're going to wrap up here in a minute, but I wanted to ask this one last question because I think it's really important.
Yeah.
The writer asks, as a parent, should I share my own experience with depression and suicidal ideation when I was young, or is that not a good idea?
You can absolutely share, but you want to also pair it with the help seeking that you did or the things you did to get better, right? So all of these stories, like the videos that we showed, are all about not just that they were struggling, but the strategies they used to get better. So yes, it's absolutely okay, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't scare the child, right? That, like, it could come back, right? And you also want to do it in a way that says, like, yeah, I was really struggling, and these are the things that helped me. Those might not help you, but that helped me. And that's okay to do. It's, again, modeling the help seeking part of it, right? That there's a thing.
Yeah.
One other resource I just want to share, sorry, on the postvention side, the loss side, that Chat Safe Guidelines has postvention guidelines also that you might want to share too.
Well, and there's a parent on with us, and I am deeply sorry, saying that they didn't know about those medications and they ended up losing their child because of confidentiality laws at college. And that,
Yeah, I'm so sorry for anybody
sorry.
that,
just
you
so
know, is a
sorry.
fellow loss survivor. And seek help yourself. This is hard. And there are support groups out there. for parents who've lost kids. And I'm happy to share some of that, afterwards with you all too.
All right. So Dr. Morris-Perez, finally, just last words as somebody who has researched, loved and lost all that you know. What final message would you like to leave us with tonight? And thank you everybody for being online, the incredible chat support of one another. It's been extraordinary.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, take care of each other, take care of your kids, take care of your friends' kids, lean on each other. And ultimately, like what gives me hope is all of the, the strength and creativity of young people. They are phenomenal. And yes, they're struggling, but they're also like thinking, they're grappling with really tough things in ways that I think they just, with a little bit of scaffolding and support, I actually think are, I'm really excited to see sort of where they bring the world in interesting ways. So I just want to give more power back to young people in doing that and listen to them a whole lot more.
All right. Well, thank you. That's a beautiful way to end tonight's conversation because we are here to offer hope to parents and educators. And I think tonight, Pamela Morris-Perez, you've done that in spades. A beautiful conversation. And thank you, Walter Ng and Taylor Coots from Star Vista for being with us tonight. Ann Wasson from Sequoia Healthcare District. Again, that little survey is going to pop up. We hope you'll take a second. But again, thank you for a wonderful presentation tonight, Dr. Morris-Perez. And we will follow up on your leads. And everybody, thank you for being with us tonight. Really great program. We'll see you again soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.